What would you do if you found a wallet lying on a chair in a less busy cafe? No one noticed, no one watching. Would you open it, take the cash and walk away? Or would you try to find the owner, even if you had nothing yourself? For Mark, this wasn't just a passing moment of curiosity. This wallet represented something far more significant. You see, Mark hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. He hadn't slept under a roof in weeks. His life had become a blur of cold nights, aching feet, and the gnawing hunger that followed him like a shadow. On this particular morning, Mark had wandered into the cafe. Not to buy anything, he had no money, but to escape the chill outside. He hoped to warm his hands for just a few minutes before being asked to leave. That's when he saw it. A small leather wallet sat unguarded on the corner of a chair, almost out of sight. His eyes flicked around the room, scanning for its owner. Nothing. The cafe was nearly empty, except for a barista, distracted with cleaning, and a couple deep in conversation by the window. Mark hesitated. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder of the emptiness inside him. He stepped closer, glancing around one last time. Slowly, he reached for the wallet, hands trembling not from the cold this time, but from the weight of the decision he was about to make. As he opened it, the first thing he saw was cash. Folded bills, more money than he'd held in a long time. He stared at it, his mind racing. This could mean food, a warm meal, maybe even a place to stay for the night. But there was also something else in the wallet's ID card. A photo of a young woman smiled back at him, and next to it was a work badge. Mark swallowed hard. His conscience stirred, louder than the growl of his stomach. Was this really his chance to escape, or was it a test of who he still was deep down? He stood there, frozen between two choices. One would help him survive the night. The other might cost him the little dignity he had left. Mark took a deep breath, and in that moment, a decision began to form. The cafe was small, cozy, and smelled of freshly brewed coffee. It was the kind of place where the baristas knew your name, and the regulars always had their usual orders waiting. Mornings here were a mix of soft chatter, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the occasional sound of a bell ringing as the door opened. Lisa was one of those regulars, a young woman in her late 20s. She juggled more responsibilities than she liked to admit, between a demanding job, helping her aging parents, and trying to keep up with the chaos of daily life. Lisa rarely had a moment to breathe, but this cafe was her oasis. Every morning, she stopped by for her favorite vanilla latte before heading to work. It was her little slice of peace, a small ritual that helped her face the day ahead. But this morning was different. Lisa had been running late, answering emails on her phone as she hurried in and out of the cafe. In her rush, she didn't notice the wallet that had slipped from her bag. It sat there, unnoticed, on the edge of her chair, a small item, yet one that carried so much of her life. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, Mark was waking up to another day on the streets. His bed was a patch of concrete behind a hardware store, shielded from the wind by a dumpster. Mark wasn't always homeless. Once, he had a job, a family, and a house with a garden. But life had a way of unraveling faster than he could hold it together. A series of bad breaks, starting with a layoff, followed by mounting medical bills, and finally, the collapse of his marriage had left him with nothing. Now, Mark's days were a constant struggle to find food, stay warm, and avoid the looks of pity or, worse, judgment from strangers. But even in his hardest moments, Mark tried to hold on to one thing, his sense of right and wrong. As Lisa rushed to her office, unaware of what she'd left behind, Mark was wandering the streets, looking for a place to stay warm. When he stepped into the cafe that morning, it wasn't for coffee or food. He couldn't afford those luxuries. He just needed a break from the cold. That's when his eyes landed on the wallet. Two lives, so different yet so connected, were about to collide. Lisa, a woman trying to hold everything together, and Mark, a man who had lost almost everything. Neither knew it yet, but this forgotten wallet would become the center of a story neither of them could ever forget. Mark had been sitting in the corner of the cafe for a while now, trying to blend in with the hum of conversations and the clatter of cups. The warmth inside felt like a gift, a break from the biting cold outside. He didn't dare make eye contact with anyone he'd learned that people often avoided looking at him too. Then, his eyes caught something unusual. On a chair just a few feet away sat a wallet. At first, he thought it was just a shadow or a misplaced napkin. But no, it was a wallet. It was sitting there like it was waiting to be found. Mark hesitated. He glanced around the cafe. The group at the table nearby seemed too engrossed in their conversation to notice, and the barista was busy. Whoever had left it was long gone. Slowly, Mark stood up, his hands trembling, not out of fear, but out of hesitation. As he picked up the wallet, it felt heavier than he expected, like it was holding more than just money. He opened it cautiously, his heart pounding. Inside, there was cash. Not just a few crumpled bills, but a thick stack of 20s. For a man who hadn't held more than a few dollars at once in weeks, it looked like a fortune. Mark's stomach growled, sharp and insistent. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. His mind began racing. This could buy food, hot food. This could mean a blanket for the cold nights. Maybe even a place to sleep, just for one night. But his conscience wasn't quiet. It was louder, sharper than his hunger. It's not yours. Someone is missing this. Someone worked for this. He closed the wallet quickly, as if keeping it open would tempt him further. Mark's gaze dropped to the floor. What if the person who lost it needed this money as much as he did? For the next few minutes, he just sat there, the wallet clutched in his hands, staring out the window. People walked by, living their lives, unaware of the choice weighing on him. Mark thought about his own life, how it had unraveled bit by bit. He had been in dark places before, but he had always tried to hold on to his sense of right and wrong. Was this a test? A chance to prove to himself that even now, when the world had given him so little, he could still do the right thing. Minutes felt like hours as Mark wrestled with himself. His hunger and desperation were real, but so was his moral compass. Finally, he took a deep breath, his decision made. Mark sat quietly in the corner of the cafe, the wallet still in his hands. His decision was clear, now he would return it. But as the reality of what that meant set in, new questions flooded his mind. How? Where would he even start? He carefully opened the wallet again, hoping for a clue. Inside, he found a driver's license tucked behind a few cards. The photo showed a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Her name was Lisa. Beside it, he spotted a work ID with the logo of a local office building he'd walked past many times. Mark stared at the ID for a moment, hesitating. This is it. This is where she works. But the thought of stepping into that world, polished and busy, was daunting. A man like him didn't belong there, and he knew it. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was something he had to do. Lisa didn't just lose money, she lost a part of her day. Maybe her sense of security. If someone had returned his own belongings during his darker moments, it might have changed everything for him. Mark stood up, stuffing the wallet carefully into his coat pocket. The cafe had grown quieter, the morning rush fading. He stepped out into the cold air, pulling his coat tighter around him. The walk to Lisa's workplace wasn't far, but it felt like miles. Each step was heavy, not just from the weight of his own exhaustion, but from the burden of what he was about to do. As he approached the building, it loomed tall and clean, with glass doors that reflected the busy street. Mark's reflection stared back at him, his worn jacket, unshaven face, and scuffed shoes. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, gripping the wallet tightly in his pocket. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately, but so did the stares. A security guard glanced his way, then back again, his brow furrowing slightly. A group of professionals walked past, their conversations breaking off briefly as they noticed him. Mark kept his eyes forward, focusing on the receptionist's desk. The young woman behind it was busy typing, barely glancing up as he approached. "Excuse me," Mark said, his voice quiet but steady. The receptionist looked up, her expression neutral but cautious. "Can I help you?" I need to return this. "It belongs to someone who works here," Mark said, pulling the wallet out and placing it carefully on the counter. He could see her hesitate, her eyes flicking between him and the wallet. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, her tone professional but curious. "Her name's Lisa," Mark replied, pointing to the work ID still inside the wallet. "I found this, and I thought she might need it back." The receptionist's expression softened slightly as she glanced at the ID, then back at Mark. "Hold on," she said, picking up the phone. As she made the call, Mark stepped back, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of the stairs around him, but he kept his focus on the counter. He had made it this far, he couldn't turn back now. Moments later, the receptionist hung up. "She's on her way down," she said, her tone lighter now. Mark nodded, stepping to the side to wait. He could feel his hands trembling, but he told himself it didn't matter. What mattered was doing the right thing, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. The sound of footsteps echoed from the nearby hallway, and Mark turned to see Lisa approaching. Her expression was one of confusion at first, but as her eyes landed on the wallet in Mark's hand, it shifted to something else: relief, gratitude, and a hint of disbelief. For Mark, it was the first time in a long while that he felt seen, not as a man struggling to get by, but as someone who had something to offer. And that moment, as small as it seemed, was everything. The moment Lisa stepped into the lobby, her pace slowed. She scanned the room, her eyes falling on Mark, who stood awkwardly near the reception desk. Her expression shifted, curiosity, confusion, and then a glimmer of recognition as her gaze dropped to the wallet in his hands. Mark hesitated, holding it up slightly. "This is your wallet, right?" he said, his voice calm but laced with nervousness. Lisa's hand instinctively went to her bag, realizing too late that it wasn't there. Her eyes widened, and she took a step closer. "Oh my gosh. Yes, that's mine," she exclaimed. Her voice carried a mixture of relief and disbelief. Mark extended the wallet toward her, his grip firm but his hand trembling slightly. Lisa took it gently, flipping it open to check its contents. Everything was there, her cards, her cash. She looked up at him, her brow furrowing slightly, as if trying to piece together how this stranger had come into possession of it. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her tone soft but curious. Mark shifted his weight, glancing at the ground before meeting her gaze. "At the café. You must have left it behind this morning," he explained. For a moment, there was silence between them, filled only by the distant hum of office chatter and the faint tapping of keyboards. Then, Lisa smiled, genuine. Warm smile that seemed to light up the otherwise cold and formal lobby. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady now. "I don't even know what to say. You've saved me so much trouble." Mark shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It just felt like the right thing to do," he replied simply. Lisa studied him for a moment, her gratitude mingling with curiosity. There was something about Mark's weathered coat, his cautious demeanor that hinted at a story far beyond this small act of kindness. "Can I ask?" she began hesitantly. "What made you return it? I mean, you could have just kept it." Mark looked away briefly, his expression tightening. "I've lost things before," he said after a pause. "Things I couldn't afford to lose. I guess I just know what it feels like." Lisa nodded, sensing there was more beneath his words. "Do you? Mind if I ask about you? I mean, if it's okay. You don't have to share anything." For a moment, Mark seemed to wrestle with himself. His instinct was to brush her off, to keep his story hidden. But something in her tone, gentle, sincere, made him pause. He glanced around the room, noticing the curious stares had faded, and then back at Lisa. "I've been through some rough times," he admitted quietly. "Lost my job a few years back, and, well, one thing led to another. Things just got away from me." Lisa listened intently, her expression softening. "That sounds really hard," she said, her voice filled with genuine empathy. Mark nodded. "It is, but it's not all bad. Sometimes you find moments like this. Moments that remind you there's still good in the world." Lisa smiled again, this time with a touch of admiration. "Well, you've done more than remind me of that today. Thank you, Mark." Hearing his name on her lips startled him for a moment. He hadn't realized she'd read it from the ID card in his wallet. But instead of feeling exposed, he felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long time. Lisa glanced at her watch, then back at Mark. "I wish I could stay and talk more," she said sincerely, "but can I do something for you? Anything? You've already done so much for me." Mark shook his head. "Just pay it forward," he said quietly. "That's enough." As Lisa stood there, clutching the wallet he'd returned, she realized she'd received far more than her belongings. In that brief exchange, she'd found a moment of connection, a reminder of the power of kindness in a world often too busy to notice. Lisa exchanged contact with Mark. Mark turned to leave, his steps lighter than when he'd arrived. And as the glass doors closed behind him, Lisa couldn't help but wonder how many others like him moved through her world, unnoticed yet full of stories worth hearing. Lisa sat at her desk that evening, the wallet now safely back in her bag, but her mind wasn't on the day's work or her usual evening routine. She couldn't stop thinking about Mark, the way he had hesitated, the quiet strength in his voice when he spoke about losing control of his life, and the way he'd asked for nothing in return. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A part of her wondered if sharing Mark's story was the right thing to do. But then she thought about how many people needed to hear it. How many might see themselves in his struggles and be inspired by his honesty and kindness. Lisa began typing. Today, a stranger changed my perspective on everything. His name is Mark. This is his story. She described the moment he returned her wallet, his quiet dignity, and the generosity he'd shown despite his own struggles. She shared how his simple act of kindness had left her moved beyond words. At the end of the post, she added a link to a crowdfunding campaign she'd just created, titled Help Mark Rebuild. She hit post, unsure of what would happen next. By morning, Lisa's phone was buzzing non-stop. Her story had gone viral. Comments flooded in from strangers around the world. This brought tears to my eyes. Let's help Mark get back on his feet. Kindness like this deserves to be rewarded. Donated. Mark's story reminds me of someone I know. Sharing this now. The donations began pouring in. $10, $20, $100. By the end of the first day, the campaign had raised over $5,000. And it didn't stop there. Mark had no idea what was happening until Lisa called him. She explained what she had done, her voice trembling with excitement and hope. At first, Mark was overwhelmed. How to respond to the outpouring of support from people he'd never met. Why would they do this for me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because you reminded them of something important, Lisa replied. That kindness matters. That even when life gets hard, we can still choose to do the right thing. Within days, Mark's life began to change. The donations allowed him to rent a small apartment space he could finally call his own. He bought groceries, replaced the worn-out shoes he'd been walking in for years, and even had enough left to get a haircut. One donor wrote, I've been in Mark's shoes before. I know how hard it is to climb out of that hole. This is my way of paying it forward. Another shared, Mark's story reminded me of my dad. He struggled, too, but he never gave up. I hope this helps him find his way. The campaign continued to gain traction, and soon, opportunities started coming Mark's way. A local business owner who had seen the story offered him an interview. We need people like you on our team, the man had said. Mark walked into that interview, wearing a suit he'd purchased with the help of the donations. His nerves were undeniable, but so was his gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he felt like his life was moving forward. The ripple effect of one small act of kindness was undeniable. Mark's decision to return the wallet had not only changed his life, but it also inspired countless others to believe in the power of doing good. Lisa watched from afar as Mark began to rebuild his life. She knew she had only played a small part in his journey, but she also understood that sometimes all it takes is one person to spark a wave of change. Mark sat on the edge of his bed, the sunlight streaming through the small window of his new apartment. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. Food, a new job, and a fresh start. He looked around the room, still sparsely furnished but undeniably his. It was the first time in years he'd felt a sense of ownership, of belonging. Mark let out a deep breath, reflecting on how it all began. How did everything change so quickly? He thought. It wasn't luck or chance, it was a single moment. Returning that wallet was the right thing to do. But he never imagined how much it would transform his life. For so long, he'd felt invisible. But this experience showed him something profound. People do care, and kindness has the power to ripple far beyond its starting point. He leaned back, a faint smile crossing his face. One small act, he murmured, and it gave me my life back. Lisa, meanwhile, sat at her favorite cafe, sipping her usual cup of tea. She scrolled through her phone, reading the hundreds of comments, still pouring in on her post about Mark. Each one reminded her of the same lesson she'd learnt that day. It's often the little things that make the biggest difference. She thought back to the moment Mark approached her, his hesitant steps, the way his voice had trembled slightly when he spoke. At the time, it seemed like a simple act of returning something that didn't belong to him. But now, she saw the bigger picture. Her eyes lingered on one of the comments. This story gave me hope. It reminded me that even in the hardest times, there's always light to be found. Lisa realized something that day. Every person has the power to create change, even in the smallest ways. She put down her phone and smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the chain of events that had unfolded. For both Mark and Lisa, the experience left a mark that would stay with them forever. It wasn't just about the wallet. It was about the choices they had made. Mark's decision to do the right thing, even when life was at its hardest, showed the strength of his character. Lisa's decision to share his story turned that one act of kindness into a movement that inspired thousands as they each reflected on their journey. A simple truth became clear. Kindness isn't just about grand gestures. It's about showing up for one another, even when it feels like no one's watching. This story is a reminder for all of us. Sometimes people need a second chance, and sometimes that chance comes from a single act of decency. Mark's life wasn't just changed by the kindness of strangers. It was transformed because someone believed in him enough to share his story. And for Lisa, it was a lesson she'd carry forever. That small actions, done with the right intentions, can create waves of change far beyond what we can see. Mark stood at the edge of a park, watching children play under the warm afternoon sun. His new work uniform fit snugly, a visible symbol of the opportunities he now had. His life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. For the first time in years, he felt hope, a small but steady light guiding him. Lisa, meanwhile, sat in her living room, scrolling through the final updates on the crowdfunding campaign, overwhelmed by the generosity of strangers. She realized how a single choice had connected so many lives. Mark's story reminds us of the incredible power of kindness. It isn't always loud or grand. Sometimes it's as simple as returning a wallet. Yet the impact ripples outward, touching lives in ways we may never see. For Mark, it was a second chance to rebuild, to dream, and to hope again. For Lisa, it was proof that small actions can make a big difference, not just for one person, but for an entire community. And for everyone who followed their story, it was a reminder we all have the power to create change. In a world that often feels overwhelming, it's easy to believe that our small efforts don't matter. But Mark's journey teaches us otherwise. Every kind word, every small action, every moment of compassion, it all adds up. If this story moved you, let it inspire action. Share it with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe to hear more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. And as you go about your day, remember, your small actions can create big ripples. Because kindness doesn't just change lives, transforms the world. One moment at a time.